Good day, everyone. My name is Daryl Kimball, and I want to welcome everyone to the second of our Critical NPT Issues webinars, which are sponsored by the Arms Control Association and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. As I said, I'm Daryl Kimball with the Arms Control Association. I'll be the moderator today for our discussion on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As many of you know, the pivotal 10th review conference of the NPT has been rescheduled and will most likely be taking place or beginning in January of 2021. And by that time, there may be enough states that have ratified the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, to trigger its entry into force. And as a large group of civil society organizations wrote in a joint statement back in May about the NPT, the achievement of the disarmament obligations outlined in Article 6 of the NPT is facilitated by the legally binding norm to prohibit nuclear weapons. That will be established by this new treaty, since otherwise a world free of nuclear weapons can neither be achieved nor maintained. So today we have two great panelists who've been at the center of efforts to negotiate the TPNW and to advance its entry into force. They'll analyze the legal relationship between the TPNW and the NPT, including how the Prohibition Treaty contributes to NPT Article 6 disarmament objectives and the status of the ongoing effort to secure the additional signatures and ratifications necessary to move the treaty forward. And after each panelist speaks this morning for about 10 minutes, we're going to take your questions. We're going to do that by asking you to put your question into the Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And Allison at Reaching Critical will help me sort through the many questions that we're expecting. We may not be able to get to everyone's questions because we have quite a few people on this call. Let me introduce our panelists. First, we'll hear from George-Wilhelm Gelhoffer, who's the head of the Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Division at the Federal Ministry of European International Affairs with the government of Austria. He's also the executive secretary of the Hague Code of Conduct at the Austrian Federal Ministry. And he'll be followed by Anna Ikeda, who is the program associate on disarmament, peace, and security programs at Soka Gakkai International Office for UN Affairs. She's speaking to us this morning from Las Vegas, Nevada, home of many nuclear test explosions in the past. And she's been part of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So with that, let me ask George-Wilhelm to start us out. Unmute yourself, please, and we'll look forward to hearing the views of the Austrian government on the TPNW and the upcoming NPT review conference. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Daryl, and thank you for having me. This month is of particular significance, of course, 75 years after the horrific nuclear bomb explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I want to pay tribute to the tireless efforts that have been done by the Hibakusha, but also of the survivors of the test explosions, who urge us on to the adoption of the TPNW. Now on to the matter at hand. Let me turn to the relationship between the NPT and the TPNW. We've already laid out some of these points in a paper that we submitted to the 2019 NPT PrepCom. So in case that's of interest to you, you'll find more detail also in there. So I'll briefly lay out why the NPT needs implementation by further instruments, how that is reflected in practice, and how the TPNW builds on this practice and is not only compatible, but necessary for the NPT's effective implementation. So on the NPT and its implementation, I needn't tell you that the NPT, now in its 30th year, clearly is the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. This was true before the TPNW, and it's even more so since its adoption. That overarching nature of the NPT is also reflected in its structure. It's a framework agreement with a very short treaty text that needs to be implemented through follow-on treaties that build on general provisions contained in the NPT. So let's look at some examples. Of the NPT's 3 pillars, non-proliferation is the most defined, with about 6 paragraphs of detail on prohibition, safeguards, etc. Nevertheless, a plethora of legal instruments, as well as practical implementation via an international organization, the IAEA, is required to give effect to its articles. The most prominent instruments are the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements with 175 countries and the additional protocol with 136 concluded, as well as the CTBT, of course. On the peaceful uses pillar, in the NPT treaty, the text is much shorter, with essentially only 2 paragraphs. Its details are being filled in from nuclear security to nuclear safety, with an ongoing process of implementation and efforts to strengthen the regime. Some examples here are the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material in the area of nuclear security, or the Convention on the Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident in the area of safety. Now, turning to the nuclear disarmament pillar, Article 6 is really quite brief, with 1 paragraph only, and requires effective measures that can be either practical or legal. The NPT in Article 6 therefore explicitly requires additional legal instruments. And while we have a first step towards multilateral implementation via the CTBT, yet to enter into force, Article 6 has been mostly implemented bilaterally to date. That is, via arms control agreements between the Russian Federation and the United States, the 2 largest possessors. While the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, now sadly defunct, does not contain references to the NPT, numerous arms limitation treaties have included explicit references. New Start of 2010 contains the following preambular paragraph: committed to the fulfillment of their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT of July 1, 1968, and to the achievement of the historic goal of freeing humanity from the nuclear threat, end quote. Thus explicitly confirming that nuclear arms control and disarmament agreements serve to implement Article 6. Similar references can be found in SALT of 2002, START 1 of 91, and SALT 1 of 1972. These explicit references to the fulfillment of Article 6 obligations clearly show that its parties recognize that such treaties are in fulfillment of the NPT. As such, they complement the CTBT, the TPNW, a future fissile material cutoff treaty, and subsequent treaties on nuclear disarmament. The demise of important arms control treaties, such as the INF, conversely, are steps away from the fulfillment of Article 6 of the NPT and run counter to the NPT's Article 6 obligations. So to summarize, the NPT, by its very nature, does not contain legal provisions on all issues that are necessary for its implementation. And consequently, further legal instruments are required for the full implementation of its 3 pillars. Now, let me briefly turn to how the TPNW builds on this practice and is not only compatible, but necessary for the NPT. The TPNW is very clear in its intention of building on and implementing the NPT. PP18 clearly confirms the NPT as the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime and goes beyond by affirming that, I quote, the full and effective implementation of the NPT has a vital role to play in promoting international peace and security, end quote. As explained above, the NPT as a framework agreement needs further implementing measures to fulfill its Article 6 disarmament obligations. Now, it is generally accepted that the full implementation of Article 6 requires a legally binding norm to prohibit nuclear weapons, since otherwise a world free of nuclear weapons cannot be achieved nor maintained. Indeed, this is the model chosen for chemical and biological weapons, the other 2 categories of weapons of mass destruction. And this very norm came about for nuclear weapons by the adoption by 122 countries of the TPNW on 7 July 2017. The prohibition itself, of course, only represents a step which needs to be followed by further steps to achieve the ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. The treaty contains clear pathways towards a world free of nuclear weapons in its Article 4, representing an effective measure as foreseen in the NPT's Article 6. Furthermore, the prohibitions in Article 1 strengthen the global non-proliferation disarmament regime. The TPNW also contributes to non-proliferation, I'll touch on this just briefly, by prohibitions on stationing, as well as the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The safeguards provisions contained in Article 3 of the TPNW equally exceed the NPT requirements. The TPNW therefore strengthens and contributes to the NPT as a whole. So in closing, the NPT requires further instruments to implement its provisions, as we've seen. The TPNW expressly and logically builds on the NPT, as other instruments have done, and is indispensable for the full implementation of the NPT's Article 6. The TPNW will need to be followed by further effective measures to achieve the ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. And TPNW not only contributes to the effective implementation of the NPT's Article 6, but in fact strengthens the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a whole. Thanks again, and I look forward to your questions.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. That was filled with facts and very concise, so appreciate that very much. So now we'll turn to Anna, who is going to tell us more about the status of efforts to bring the treaty into force, what's being done at the governmental and the non-governmental level. So thanks again for being with us.
Thank you so much, Daryl. As mentioned, my name is Anna Ikeda, and I work for the Office for UN Affairs of Soka Gakkai International, SGI, which is a Buddhist organization dedicated to peace, culture, and education. It's my pleasure to be here today. And first of all, I hope everybody who has tuned in today is staying safe and healthy. And I also want to thank the Arms Control Association and WILF for organizing these webinars to keep the momentum going toward the NPT Review Conference as we navigate such uncertain times today, in the so-called new normal. So following the presentation that George-Wilhelm just gave about the relationship between the TPNW and NPT, and thank you so much once again. That was a wonderful presentation. I would like to now speak from the perspective of the civil society, and particularly ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. I'll mainly comment on the status of efforts to bring the TPNW into force and what implications it may have in the context of the NPT. I'd imagine most of you are familiar with ICAN and its work, but just to be on the same page, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons is a coalition of NGOs promoting adherence to and implementation of the TPNW. ICAN has 570 partner organizations in 103 countries. My organization, SGI, is an international partner of ICAN. And during the negotiations of the TPNW, SGI advocated for the reference to peace and disarmament education in the treaty text, which was included in the preamble. Many of our national organizations in the SGI conduct educational activities at the grassroots level to raise awareness of the threat of nuclear weapons and to inform the public of the significance of the TPNW. In doing so, we help people revisit the notion of security based on the threat of force and envision a future without nuclear weapons. Since the adoption of the treaty, we have also been focusing on the efforts toward the entry into force of the TPNW, particularly in the Caribbean region. So as an example, SGI worked with ICAN and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Guyana and coordinated a regional forum on the TPNW in Georgetown, Guyana last June. Representatives from 10 governments attended for the two-day event, and where we discussed the significance of the TPNW, its relevance to the region, and the processes for signature and ratification, among other things. The relationship between the NPT and TPNW was actually one of the topics that we covered at the forum as well. At the time of the forum, out of the 14 countries that are members of the Caribbean community, only 2 had ratified the TPNW. Today, just 1 year later, the number has grown to 8. So I'm proud to say that it's through such efforts of the campaigners working in every region and developing relationships with wonderful diplomats and other stakeholders that every day we're moving closer to the entry into force of the TPNW. And we celebrate every signature and ratification, knowing that they bring us closer to the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. We started the year 2020 with Paraguay's ratification in January, bringing the total number of states parties at that time to 35. Since then, despite the lockdown with COVID-19, we've had a number of ratifications, including Namibia, Belize, Lesotho, Fiji, and Botswana. And then on August 6th, which was the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Nigeria and Ireland ratified the treaty, and Niue acceded to it. And on August 9th, which was Nagasaki Day, St. Kitts and Nevis ratified. With that, the current number of the states parties is 44. This means that we only need 6 more ratifications before reaching the 50 ratifications for the treaty to enter into force. The TPNW will enter into force 90 days after the 50th state deposits its instrument of ratification. Also, to date, 84 countries have signed the TPNW, with Malta being the latest signatory. They actually just signed this past Tuesday. I can also say that some countries are currently working on completing their internal processes for ratification, while others are doing so for the signatures. So what this would mean is that with the NPT review conference postponed until next year, as Daryl mentioned in the beginning, the timing is such that it's quite likely that the TPNW will have 50 ratifications by the time of the review conference. It is a matter of time. The upcoming review conference will be the first one since the adoption of the TPNW in 2017. So if you think about that, it's quite exciting to think about the development with the TPNW within the current NPT cycle. And I feel it's fitting as this year marked not only the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the 50th anniversary of the NPT itself and 25th anniversary of its indefinite extension. It's about time that real progress is made toward nuclear disarmament. After all, what was the catalyst for the process to adopt the TPNW was the deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons expressed by many states at the 2010 NPT review conference. We have heard much criticism against TPNW, such as that it's divisive or that it weakens the non-proliferation regime. We heard this, for example, during the Security Council meeting on the NPT in February, and also during the first committee debates at the end of last year. Because of this, it's quite reasonable to expect similar debates during the review conference about how to move disarmament forward. We find this rhetoric distracts attention from the larger, more profound way that the threat of nuclear weapons divides humanity into those with the ability to threaten and those who live under the threat. Echoing the previous presentation, our message has consistently been that the achievement of the obligations outlined in Article 6 of the NPT is facilitated by a legally binding norm to prohibit nuclear weapons. TPNW complements and strengthens the NPT as an effective measure, as foreseen in Article 6. TPNW stigmatizes nuclear weapons, which has impacts beyond just states parties to the treaty. We have seen this already through some countries divesting their funds from nuclear weapons, for example. It will change the legal and political landscape surrounding nuclear weapons. With the entry into force of the TPNW in the foreseeable future, it is critical that the NPT states parties engage in more productive discussions addressing the humanitarian concerns underpinning the TPNW and the validity of nuclear deterrence. The only certain assurance against the use of nuclear weapons is their elimination. The fact is that the overwhelming majority of the world's states, including those that do not adhere to the TPNW at this point, maintain security policies that are not dependent on nuclear weapons, which means that they accept its core norms. As a member of ICANN, toward the review conference and beyond, we will continue doing what we know is the best way to uphold the spirit of the NPT and advance disarmament. That is to call on all states to adhere to the TPNW. We look forward to celebrating the entry into force of the TPNW soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was very helpful, and we have a lot on the table, and we have some questions coming in. We had a few questions in advance of this webinar, and I just want to thank those of you who stuck with us despite the delay on Monday due to the Zoom snafu, but we're back here and we have plenty of participants and questions. And we also have some questions coming in this morning live. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section not the chat, and Allison Pidlack will help me sort through those. But I wanted to start by asking a question that came in earlier, and I want to ask George-Wilhelm to start addressing this one, and maybe Anna, you have some additional suggestions. We have a couple questions, one from Senator Doug Roach of Canada regarding how Austria and other TPNW supporters hope to see the treaty and its value reflected in the NPT review conference in what could be a final conference document. I mean, what are you looking for in the context of the NPT diplomatic process itself?
If you'd like me to go first, happy to do so. So I think there's an important point to make, which is that the TPNW isn't something that should, or from our point of view, will be an obstacle to the NPT and adopting an outcome document. In fact, the NPT has a lot of open issues, frankly, that have nothing to do with the TPNW. First of all, that being implementation. Now, the TPNW as such, as we see it, as I've explained, is there to implement the NPT and to make further progress, but it's not something that the NPT review process as such should be focusing on, because we should be focusing on the review since the last review conference. And secondly, if you look at the last PrepCom, actually, there have been some very good attempts at trying to come together over bridge formulations that will be rather general and thereby bridge the gap. I mean, I don't think it's in anybody's interest to make the NPT review conference about the TPNW. And it shouldn't be from either side. In fact, there are plenty of points where we can come together in terms of the forward-looking part, and in the backward-looking part, frankly, it's really about implementation.
All right, thank you. Anna, do you have anything to add, or we can go on to the next? Okay, very good. Well, here's another question. Perhaps, Anna, you can start with this one that came in. Which countries do you expect are likely to ratify the TPNW next? I mean, we're at 44. The goal is to get to 50. Where are some of the key states in their ratification processes? Can you give us a little bit more detail?
Sure. And, of course, sometimes that's so hard to predict. We work on some countries that we think are so close, and then something might happen domestically, or sometimes countries that we think might take a while surprises us nicely. So, it's always, it's really hard to predict. And also, I would hate to promise anything, but at least in the region that we're working on in the Caribbean, we have 2 more countries that are signatories currently, which is Grenada and Jamaica. And they both have been diligently working on their final steps toward ratification, and we really hope that they will be among the last 6. I know there are some countries in Africa, for example, that have been working toward their signatures and ratifications, and I heard some promising news. Again, really can't say anything public until we have final confirmations. And then, of course, the latest signatory, Malta, I believe they have also been working toward their ratification. So in every region, I can say there are some that are really getting closer to their final processes. And we really hope to make a final push, especially toward September during the high-level week of the General Assembly. And also September 21st being the International Day of Peace. We really hope to have some ratifications either on that day or toward those days.
Great, thank you. And there's a related question from Guy in Cameroon. We have people tuning in from all over the world. Guy says we're currently conducting advocacy to bring Cameroon to sign and ratify the TPNW. How can we leverage the NPT to advance that goal? So that sounds like a very practical question about what campaigners can do in specific countries to leverage the NPT review conference as a way to move their national processes along. Anna, do you have any comments? And maybe George-Wilhelm, you can weigh in about what kind of outreach Austria and some of the other so-called core group states who led the way in the negotiations are doing to help facilitate state efforts to sign and ratify. So Anna, you want to start, please?
Sure. So from the ICANN side, I think one of our strategies as campaigners is that we are asking the governments to focus on key messages in their NPT statements and in their advocacy work. So definitely focus on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which again came about in the 2010 review conference. And that's really the underpinning of our TPNW movement. And by doing so, we can call on the states to recognize that TPNW is not an obstacle to the NPT, as George-Wilhelm said. It is complementary to the NPT, Article 6. It is effective implementation, and thereby, acknowledge that they should be working toward the signature and ratification. So I think by linking the NPT spirit and the purpose to TPNW, we are able to also advocate for the TPNW signature and ratification.
Very good. George-Wilhelm, anything to add?
Just briefly, of course, we're also doing plenty of outreach. One thing that's been quite effective from our side, I think, has been the side events that we've been holding, as well as the signature and ratification conferences or events that we've been doing that have been quite good in attracting groups of countries to come together and sign or ratify. So I think that's been quite an effective tool, but otherwise, I think Anna has more of the view on the ground, I suppose, than I do.
All right, very good. We have a handful of questions about the TPNW and the so-called nuclear umbrella states, those countries that have military strategies that to some extent state a reliance on being part of a deterrence system extended by nuclear armed states. And so let me try to summarize some of these three questions we have. And maybe, George-Wilhelm, you can start with this. Especially because Austria is part of the EU, how is Austria pursuing its conversations with other countries in the EU, including some that are part of NATO, about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Is there an ongoing conversation? And do you see any signs of progress in those conversations?
Thank you. Yes, it's obviously not how should I say, the most consensual point in our discussions usually, but it is something that's an ongoing conversation, be it when we negotiate EU statements, but also with our friends in NATO. We are a NATO partner, and so we regularly engage with NATO. And we have very frank conversations, and I think there is also a certain degree of realism from both sides. Clearly, on this issue, we on some things you can agree to disagree, and of course there's nuances everywhere that you then also see in these conversations. But yes, we discuss it, but it's not particularly easy conversations to have, of course. But I think what the Humanitarian Initiative has done is it's actually been quite good in also helping to sort of reframe the discussion to quite an extent, to reframe it from being this pure classic security argument to actually focusing more on human security. I think that as such is actually quite a bit of progress, even if I'm not expecting, NATO countries to join TPNW tomorrow. I think at least there's been a reframing of the discussion that is quite useful in terms of also taking measures, trust building measures, taking measures of risk reduction, etc., that the humanitarian conferences and the newly gathered knowledge there on risks has actually furthered. So I think those are positive steps, and I think those are appreciated. And you see a lot more risk reduction, for example, being the big focus, I think, by many countries at the moment in the NPT process. So I think there is a certain degree of increased understanding and appreciation of that, and we hope to keep building on that, of course.
Thank you. So let me just ask another somewhat related question, which is when the 50th ratification takes place, I mean, just walk us through what happens legally. How many days will it be before formal entry into force is triggered? What kinds of meetings of states parties would then take place? What other measures might states need to pursue given entry into force? Just walk us through what will happen after the 50th ratification is achieved and the articles are delivered to the UN Secretary General. And then, a tough question here, I mean, that came in, which is how would entry into force materially affect the long-term push for nuclear disarmament? How do you expect, or how do you hope this will influence the broader discussion on nuclear disarmament in the context of the NPT or elsewhere? So Anna or George-Wilhelm, your thoughts, please.
I can start off, and hopefully George-Wilhelm and even Daryl, if you have anything to add, please do. So first of all, in terms of the practical, I guess the steps in the legal sense, as I mentioned earlier, so after the 50th state deposits its instrument of ratification, then after 90 days, the treaty will enter into force. And then if I remember correctly, within the 1 year, the first meeting of the states parties should take place. And actually commenting on the previous question about NATO, obviously I'm not an expert in that, and there's so much being written about that as well. And I consider myself more of a student than expert in this. But I remember that Netherlands was the only country among the NATOs under the nuclear umbrella that attended the Tpnw negotiations. So just speaking about the first meeting of the states parties, I do hope that, possibly, it is possible for some of the NATO states, even though they are not ready to join the Tpnw right now, could still attend to observe the discussions. I don't know if that will benefit the Tpnw, but again, I think the more they are involved, the better than them boycotting the process. So in terms of my understanding of what happens after the 50th state depositing the ratification instrument, that's really what's going to happen next. In terms of the practical implications or impact of the Tpnw, again, I feel some are already starting to happen. So just like George-Wilhelm mentioned, this shift of discourse, from the one that's centered on security and deterrence, and talking about nuclear weapons as prestige, the source of power, the status symbol, to, through creating this new norm, the legal norm against nuclear weapons. Basically, Tpnw will make nuclear weapons illegal. And I think we can't underestimate the power of norm. We have seen that many times, through international community, international multilateral processes. By stigmatizing nuclear weapons, there are severe implications about what that means. As I mentioned, there are already some, banks and pension funds pulling out investments from nuclear weapons, which would mean that, again, it will affect the productions related to nuclear weapons. And that can have, very practical implications about states maintaining their nuclear arsenal, modernizing, updating nuclear arsenal. So through such steps, we really believe that nuclear Tpnw will have practical implications on the nuclear weapons.
Just to add, if I may, I completely agree with Anna. I think you've made all the pertinent points, and you're completely right. It is in Article 8, we did foresee it to be within 1 year of entry into force. The Secretary General convenes, and we as Austria have actually offered to host the first meeting of states parties already here in Vienna at the seat of the UN. Also very much agree with Anna's point about the non-states parties. I mean, at the time of the negotiations, we explicitly foresaw it also in Article 8, an invitation to non-states parties to attend as observers, as well as, of course, other relevant international organizations, regional organizations, etc. and NGOs, of course. And the idea being that even if you're not party, you can see how the treaty develops, and therefore also sort of be involved already to some degree in the process, because there will be, I'm sure, quite a few countries who will be supporters of the treaty as well, who might not have finished the procedures yet. But also, as you said, Anna, reaching out to those who may be more on the fence or on the middle ground, and even those critical, so they can see also where people are going, and their intentions are actually quite clear and transparent. In terms of what changes, I think Anna also made very, very, very good points there. I mean, a norm has power as such. You see that with a lot of examples, the mine ban treaty, of course, being a very, very good example of that, where even countries that weren't members of the treaty felt the power of the norm, not least economically. But also you see it, for example, in the case of Syria with the chemical weapons case, where the existence of the norm also, of course, in the end came back to a country that wasn't a member of the treaty initially, and then joined under a lot of international pressure.
Thank you. Well, let me just push you a little bit further, George-Wilhelm, because you brought up the future meeting of states parties, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but what kinds of issues would be discussed at a meeting of states parties? Why would it be in a country's interest, if they still haven't ratified the treaty, to be there? I mean, what do you imagine? I mean, I know the rules and the agenda have not been set, but if you could just elaborate a bit on, I'm sure you've thought about this a little bit.
Of course, we're thinking of it, and of course, it's also quite early days. I mean, it's more than a year away at this point still. But I mean, there are two elements, if you like. One thing is that there are certain things that are foreseen in the treaty for us to discuss, and that includes one particular discussion, which is the deadline of elimination. That's actually foreseen to be decided on at the first meeting of states parties. There are other things that are foreseen in Article 8 in terms of the things that will need to be discussed, from implementation. Measures that need to be taken, and other matters. Of course, there's the question if you want to set up anything in terms of structural questions, and of course there'll probably also be more general discussions of the treaty, where it's going, and the role it plays. So I think the reason to come is to see how it develops. And I think it's going to be interesting, because I'm sure there's going to be again also a very scientific discussion about nuclear weapons and strategies towards elimination and so on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think it's also interesting for countries to participate, because this is, as soon as it enters into force, and already now a part of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. So it's something that's actually an important part of the multilateral treaty regime that we have, especially once it enters into force. And so as such, I think countries would do well to sort of participate, see what's happening, and be able to also then, of course, evaluate that for the other fora that they are taking part in.
Very good. So let me come to a question from Masaki Toki that came in just a few minutes ago, that says, after entry into force of the Tpnw, it seems like divisions between supporters and non-supporters of the treaty will deepen and widen. How can we enhance efforts at bridge building after entry into force? And I would just add to that question, you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, George-Wilhelm. I mean, how can that bridge building take place at the NPT review conference? I mean, and is that a fair assumption that's embedded in this question, that after entry into force, divisions between Tpnw supporters and skeptics, do you expect will widen?
I would not think so, to be honest with you. I think there was a certain initial sort of reaction to the Tpnw being adopted, But I think that actually only exposed, if you like, an underlying a conflict that was already brewing in the NPT. I mean, it's no surprise that the TPNW came after the 2015 NPT review conferences, where these conflicts already were coming to the fore. You know, there was a disappointment with the lack of implementation of commitments and obligations in the NPT in terms of disarmament. There was an increased awareness, of course, of the risks that are existing, and of the progressing time, which only increases the likelihood of those risks becoming practical. And in fact, you saw the beginning of modernization programs and the trillions that were, you know, designed to perpetuate nuclear possession and upgrade arsenals or increase arsenals for decades to come. So clearly there was a clear already split between those countries that really wanted to see progress in disarmament and those who were, you know, wishing to maintain the status quo or even increasing arsenals. So the TPNW, I think, is more a reflection of the times and of these developments, rather than as such being something that came about and sowed new divisions. So I don't think that further divisions will come about just because the treaty enters into force. I think everybody's expecting the treaty to enter into force. It's been very obvious that the TPNW has gone very fast in being ratified, and so I think nobody, you know, who watches the treaty sphere is particularly surprised that it's coming into force. And I think bridge building is happening. I mean, things like risk reduction are bridge building measures as such. They're making progress towards alleviating some of the issues that exist. And I think even when it comes to the TPNW, I think there's much more of a willingness now also from the other side to accept certain basic elements and not to sort of dismiss everything that the TPNW stands for. So I don't think there is a danger, and secondly, I think there are very good bridge building proposals that are already being put on the table, and I think, you know, the chair of the last PrepCom, I think, really was working very much in that direction, and I'm sure that can be picked up by the chair of the REFCON as well.
All right, thank you. Let me just add one thought of my own on the question about bridge building and you know, how skeptics of the TPNW might respond after entry into force. You know, there will be a moment when the treaty does formally enter into force. And I think one of the things that would help advance the cause of the NPT and build bridges between the nuclear haves and have-nots would be for some of the European NATO states to actually issue statements welcoming the entry into force of the TPNW, even though they cannot at this time sign and ratify the treaty, and recognize that it is a contribution to the broader legal framework regarding the elimination of nuclear weapons that's embedded in Article 6. I mean, a statement along those lines from the Dutch, from the Germans, I don't expect it will come from the French, you know, could be very useful in terms of moving forwards and recognizing what is now inevitable, which is that the TPNW is going to enter into force. Let me come back to a very specific question, which is actually too long for me to read because, but it comes from Noah Mayhew, and this one is for George-Wilhelm, and it's specifically about the perception or the reality that the TPNW standard for safeguards is different from that of the NPT, and specifically because the TPNW does not mention the additional protocol. I mean, could you address your view as one of the delegations negotiating the treaty, you know, what the intention was during the negotiations regarding the safeguards provision and why that does or does not align with the NPT standards?
Certainly, I mean, that's a question we get a lot, and indeed, if you look at the NPT, I mean, you don't have a requirement for an additional protocol, of course, in the NPT. And of course, not all NPT members have additional protocols. And the same, of course, runs for the TPNW. So what we try to do is to also, of course, to be able to have everybody on board, is to have a higher standard, which would not allow a sort of fallback below the standards that people have already achieved. So to sort of draw a line with the status quo that a country has when it signs or joins the TPNW, which for 136 countries, if I remember correctly, is the additional protocol, and to encourage them to go higher. But you can't, you know, with countries joining right now, you can't then require them to immediately also accede to the additional protocol. So for us, the intention was to have a higher standard than the NPT, which we do have in the treaty clearly, because we have that non-fallback clause. So for 136 countries, we already have the additional protocol as the mandatory standard in the TPNW. And for the remaining countries that still need to sign an additional protocol, that is encouraged but not required.
Very good, thank you. So we have another question from Chuck Johnson from the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is a lead organization in ICANN, about the role that China might play in the TPNW discussion. The question is, you know, whether you believe, either of you believe that China might take a more conciliatory or positive role towards the TPNW in the near to medium distance. I would just also note that, somewhat surprisingly, China joined the Arms Trade Treaty recently, so I think that might be what's giving rise to this question. And I would just tack on to that for Anna. I mean, what efforts is ICANN making to encourage states like China or India or even Russia to think differently about the TPNW? So maybe George-Wilhelm, if you could start. It's something of a speculative question, but it's an interesting one.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a difficult question to sort of, you know, see into the future there. I mean, so far there's definitely not been a particular sort of you know, rush of interest in that sense from China. But the Chinese have always been very interested in the treaty and in the process, and have always sort of followed it, I think, with great interest. But of course, we do see at the same time, you know, that also the Chinese are pursuing upgrading and modernization programs. So of course, they, like the other NPT nuclear weapon states, at the moment are going in an opposite direction to the TPNW and to eliminating nuclear weapons. It is speculative, and I mean, as we always say, the TPNW is an instrument that needs to be followed by further instruments, and presumably the best way to make progress there would also be by something like an agreement between several of the nuclear weapon states to reduce jointly. But that's just one option, of course, that could be pursued. So at the moment, I'm afraid I can also only purely speculate. But it is interesting because, of course, China has always been very explicit about having a purely defensive intention for its nuclear weapons program. So that declaratorily would potentially make it easier for them as a step to move towards nuclear elimination.
So Anna, your thoughts on campaigning in Beijing for the TPNW or other capitals?
Right. Yeah, and I can't say I know, you know, too much about that. I don't think we have campaigners in China, for example. You know, I'm not sure actually if we have campaigners, active campaigners in India. I'll have to go back and check. So I'll talk more in, I guess, general terms about campaigning within nuclear armed states. And of course, you know, that's a very different game than, you know, campaigning in regions like Caribbean, for example, where governments generally agree to nuclear disarmament. It's just a matter of more bureaucracy and, you know, practical things that they have to do. You know, because many of them are under nuclear weapon free zones. So, for example, in the US, and actually, I think Chuck is more familiar with this than myself. Some campaigners are working, for example, toward cities supporting nuclear, Tpnw, by signing on to the cities appeal. Parliamentarians supporting the Tpnw that have been successful in many countries, including nuclear armed states and their allies. So I think those grassroots efforts to build not only the public opinion, but political will from within, I think can go a long way. When administration changes, for example, those things can start to build up for specific policy change in the future. Within the US, where I'm more familiar with because I live here, there are some campaigns as well. For example, some campaigners are doing nuclearban.us to promote the Tpnw within the US context and engage people to align themselves with the Tpnw's values and principles. There's also Back from the Brink campaign, more working not only in the capital but in some cities to adapt resolutions calling for no first use of nuclear weapons from the US government side. So I think these advocacy efforts are happening within those countries to build potential political will toward the future.
Thank you. So I got another question here that kind of brings the conversation back to the NPT review conference. So, I mean, George-Wilhelm, you've described and argued as to why the Tpnw contributes to the fulfillment of the Article 6 obligations. And you've mentioned that, the Tpnw has not been the cause of the friction within the NPT treaty discussions. I mean, obviously, a lot of that has been due to the fact that the United States and Russia have been discarding and abandoning key arms control treaties, and their dialogue has diminished. So the question is, and you referred to risk reduction initiatives in general terms. I mean, from an Austrian perspective, I mean, what kind of steps, specifically on disarmament, does the review conference, I mean, should the review conference endorse and embrace in the forward-looking part of the discussions? And, given that this conference is going to take place in an odd month, January, and we may have a new presidential administration in the middle of the review conference, I mean, what chances are there for realistically a consensus final conference document? I mean, that's a difficult question, but I mean, it's at the core. And if you could offer your thoughts about what specifically should be in that forward-looking package relating to Article 6.
That is a difficult question, indeed. In fact, we don't even know whether the review conference will be taking place in January yet. That hasn't been confirmed yet by the member states. It's only been a proposal that's been on the table, but there's not been any opinion or any decision made yet on it, actually. So we still don't really know. On the chances, first of all, that's really hard to predict because it depends on a lot of factors. And it's interesting, I mean, if you look at the elements that broke or that didn't allow a consensus document in 2015, it wasn't actually the disarmament pillar that seemed to be the main sticking point. At least the countries that spoke were particularly breaking the final document over the Middle East part. And of course, we don't know how that will turn out this year, but of course there are plenty of other sticking points that will be extremely difficult to resolve. So it's not going to be an easy conference to come to a result with, that's for sure. But I think at the same time, there's also a lot of interest in having a result because it would now be 10 years already not to have an outcome document, and so that's a long time, in fact. So I think there's a drive to have it. The question is how you approach it. The risk reduction is a potential rallying point. In fact, for our ideas, I mean, one of the things that we always refer back to is the working group on taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations, the open-ended working group in Geneva, that actually not only laid out the need for a negotiation of a prohibition treaty, but it also very clearly laid out a long list of elements that could be pursued for risk reduction. And this was actually an agreement that a part of the text that was not disputed. It was really the prohibition element that was disputed, and that in the end a couple of countries broke consensus over, which then turned it into a large majority vote. But these elements were not disputed, and I think they're quite useful as starting points to look at what measures there can be. And it's quite a catalogue, in fact. So, I mean, of course, we won't agree on every single one of them. But at the same time, there are a lot of things from, a lot of very practical measures, from things like the alerting to hotlines being built up to doctrines to there's an entire plethora. And we could actually, I think, take out very usefully a lot of these measures and build those into the final document. And as we saw from the fact that these were not disputed, I think it would be not that difficult to build a consensus around those.
Very good. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't note that one of our next webinars in this Critical NPT Issues series is going to be on measures that would help advance Article 6 objectives. So the Arms Control Association and Reaching Critical Will be collaborating again to focus in on the question I was just asking, which is hard to answer. So we're about out of time. I want to ask a final question of both of you to address, which I think is a very good one to end upon. And we've spent a good bit of time here analyzing the legal relationship between these two instruments. We've talked about the status towards entry into force and what happens next. What kind of impact from a moral perspective on this issue do you believe the entry into force of the TPNW will provide? I mean, George-Wilhelm, you took note of the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear detonations in New Mexico and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How important do you think this is for global thinking about the moral dimensions of nuclear weapons today? So Anna, you want to start, please?
Sure. And again, thank you so much for the very productive and wonderful discussion. I learned a lot today. Yeah, and I think that's really, something that our organization really value is the moral obligation to abolish nuclear weapons. And I'm really, thrilled that finally the momentum toward abolishing nuclear weapons came from, I think really that the moral obligation and the ethical call, really recognizing nuclear weapons as what they are, which is that they are the weapons of mass destruction that can cause devastating, catastrophic, consequences on people's lives, the environment, for generations to come. So I think really enshrining that legally has such significant impact. It can, impact the international humanitarian law. It can impact the human rights discussion. I think the potential is really infinite. So really excited about that.
Yes, I fully agree with that. I think the treaty and already I think the humanitarian initiative before that, I think were quite important because they started to reframe the discussion on moral grounds, on making clear that these are weapons that are killing indiscriminately and that cause absolutely catastrophic humanitarian harm, so to civilian people themselves. And I think that's something that just wasn't discussed enough before. What these weapons are, what they actually do when they're used. They were seen, and they still are seen by many, as these sort of hypothetical weapons that actually, we don't really need to worry about anymore. I mean, quite contrary to the large demonstrations used to have against nuclear weapons, decades ago. Today, that isn't really on the forefront of many people's minds. I think it's now come back also because of course, the North Korea developments, but I think also to a larger degree because of the TPNW and the Humanitarian Initiative, there has been this renewed attention. There has been the reframing of the discussion. And I think there has been also, and I think that's quite an important part of the treaty as well, this recognition of the survivors and of the environmental effects and the environmental remediation that is necessary in connection with nuclear weapons. So I think there's been a reframing. I think it has already had quite an impact. And I think it will continue to actually allow us to make further progress and maybe finally break through the stalemate that we've had when it comes to nuclear disarmament in the last decades.
Well, let's hope we can break through the stalemate. And I want to just also acknowledge that George-Wilhelm and your colleagues with the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs have had a big part to play in pushing the humanitarian initiative that has helped lead to the TPNW, as well as Anna and her colleagues at ICANN in moving the process forward to the point where we currently are. So I want to thank both of you. I want to thank Alison Pitlack at Reaching Critical Will and Ray Atchison at Reaching Critical Will for their partnership in this series, which has been very rewarding. We here at the Arms Control Association look forward to working with them on the next in our Critical NPT Issues series. My colleague Tony Fleming, our communications director, working behind the scenes, will have a recording of this session available for everyone early next week. So I want to thank everybody who has tuned in from all around the world, and I want to thank you for your patience with the Zoom snow day, as we called it here in the United States, last Monday, and to come back to join us today. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much. Be safe until next time. Bye-bye.